Hello everyone, if you enjoy this video, please hit that like button, drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'm on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support means the world to me, and let's get started. I wasn't born in Motley, though some say I might as well have been. My cradle was a bundle of straw in the corner of a smoky hut, tucked beside pigs that smelled better than the men who stumbled home drunk from the tavern. My mother swore I came into this world laughing. Not crying, laughing. She said it frightened the midwife, who crossed herself 3 times and muttered that such a birth meant trouble. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was doomed to be a fool before I'd even cut my first tooth. You have to understand, being born poor in the Middle Ages wasn't just bad luck, it was a sentence. The nobles had gold and fine linen. The church had Latin prayers and power, and the rest of us had mud, hunger, and whatever scraps fell from their tables. If you wanted to survive, you needed strong arms for the plow, nimble fingers for the loom, or, if you were like me, a sharp tongue and a knack for making people laugh when they ought to be crying. I found my tongue early. I was the child who mimicked the parish priest as he droned through his sermons, rolling my eyes and wagging my finger until the other children burst into snorts that shook the pews. Of course, that earned me more than one cuff to the ear, but even the priest had to hide a smile once or twice. That's when I learned something important. Laughter was dangerous, but it was powerful too. A joke could bring you a crust of bread, a pat on the head, or, if you weren't careful, a beating that left you bruised for days. My first stage wasn't a castle hall or even a village square. It was the dung heap behind my mother's hut. The smell kept the grown-ups away, which meant it was mine to rule. I'd climb up on that steaming throne, crown myself with a crooked branch, and declare laws to the pigs. By order of King Filth, all chickens must learn to juggle. I'd shout, tossing stones until one clattered off my own head. The children laughed, and for a moment, I wasn't just a ragged boy with holes in his shoes. I was somebody. That's how it starts, you know. Not with talent, not with training, but with the hunger for eyes upon you, for the sound of laughter. It's a fire in the belly, hotter than any stew pot. And once you've tasted it, you'll risk anything to taste it again. But laughter can be a cruel master. I learned that the day I mocked the reeve, the man who kept the Lord's accounts and collected the rents. He was a sour, pinched fellow who strutted about as if he were king of the village. One day, I puffed out my chest, waddled about with an imaginary ledger, and pretended to tally how many fleas clung to each child. The villagers roared, but the reeve's face went red as a boiled beet. He dragged me by the ear to my mother and spat. "Your whelp will end on the gallows if he keeps that tongue." My mother, tired and bent from years of washing laundry that wasn't hers, looked at me with eyes sharp as knives. "If you must jest," she whispered when the reeve stormed off, "make sure you jest upward, never downward, and never at the wrong moment." I didn't understand then, but I do now. She was teaching me the first rule of survival. Humor is a blade, and you'd better know which way it cuts. We were poor. Not the sort of poor where you skip a meal and complain. I mean the kind of poor where you chew on bark in winter to trick your stomach into silence. My father, when he was sober enough to lift a tool, hired himself out as a ditch digger. Some weeks he brought home a few coins. Most weeks he brought home nothing but ale on his breath. My mother kept us alive with scraps of washing, mending, and the occasional charity loaf from the parish. So where did laughter fit in a life like that? Oddly enough, it was the only coin I could mint myself. A good jest could earn me a hunk of bread from a neighbor, or at least distract my siblings from their hunger pangs. I made a game of it, mocking the rooster's strut, babbling nonsense like the Latin chants we couldn't understand, juggling 3 stones until one smacked me in the nose. My brothers and sisters howled, and though my eyes watered with pain, I bowed like a master performer. It was in those lean years I discovered another truth. People laugh because they need to, not because the joke is clever. The villagers carried burdens heavy as millstones, rent, hunger, disease. Laughter was the one thing that lifted it, even if only for a blink. And if you could provide that blink, even as a ragged child, they'd remember you. They'd forgive you. Sometimes, they'd even feed you. One autumn, when the leaves were crisp and the wind smelled of smoke, A traveling troupe came through our village. Jugglers, tumblers, a man who swallowed fire. Miracles on two legs. I watched wide-eyed as they drew a circle in the dirt and held the crowd with nothing but rhythm and wit. I thought my heart would burst. Here were men and women making a living from laughter. They had motley coats, jingling bells, and more confidence than 10 reeves. I couldn't help myself. When they finished, I scampered into the ring and mimicked their tumbling, rolling over so many times I made myself dizzy. The crowd burst out laughing, not with cruelty, but with genuine delight. One of the jugglers, a big man with missing teeth, scooped me up and set me on his shoulders. "This one's half full already," he said. "Give him a few years, and he'll be worth his weight in coppers." I carried those words like a blessing. I had found my calling. I didn't want to dig ditches or scrub linens. I wanted to stand where everyone could see me, to make the weary forget their weariness, to turn jeers into cheers. From that day, the dung heap wasn't enough. I wanted a stage. I wanted a hall. Of course, not everyone found me amusing. The priest shook his head and muttered that mockery was a sin. The reeves still hated me. And my father, when he wasn't passed out, barked that no son of his would waste his life as a dancing monkey. He wanted me in the fields with a plow, not prancing about with riddles. But here's the thing. Once you've glimpsed a different life, the old one won't fit anymore. The village seemed smaller every day, the huts meaner, the people duller. I was restless, always scheming new pranks or songs. I carved puppets from scraps of wood, made up plays about saints and devils, and recruited my siblings to act them out. We'd hide in barns and perform for any child willing to sneak away from chores. The applause wasn't much, claps from dirty hands, squeals of laughter, but to me it was gold. And perhaps it was blasphemy, but I noticed something curious. Even when the priest thundered about sin, even when my father shouted about shame, both of them laughed sometimes. They try to hide it, but laughter is a crack in the armor. And I had a knack for finding those cracks. It was at the midsummer fair that my life truly shifted. Nobles rarely bothered with our village, but once a year their men came to collect rents, and sometimes, if we were lucky, a lord himself appeared to preside over the feast. That year, he came with banners flying, his retinue glittering with steel and silk. To me, they looked like creatures from another world. The villagers feasted on bread, meat pies, and ale, most of it watered down by the reeve, of course. A space was cleared for entertainments. The traveling troupe was gone, and no one expected much, but the reeve, decided to show his good humor by asking if anyone could perform for the Lord. Something reckless burned inside me. I stepped forward, clutching 2 potatoes I'd swiped from a cart. "I can juggle," I announced, though truth be told I could barely keep 3 stones aloft. The reeve sneered, ready to mock me, but the crowd was curious. And the Lord, bored, sipping from his silver cup, nodded. Let the boy try. So I did. I juggled those potatoes with all the clumsy courage I had. One flew too high, another tumbled too low, and at last they smacked me square in the head. The crowd erupted in laughter. Not jeers, not scorn, honest belly-deep laughter. I bowed, dizzy with pain and triumph. The Lord chuckled, a rare sound, and tossed a coin at my feet. "Not half bad," he said. "This one might have some use." That coin gleamed brighter than the sun. My mother's eyes shone with pride and fear. The reeve fumed. And me? I knew that my life was changing. I wasn't just a poor boy anymore. I was a fool in the making. If part 1 was about being born into mud and laughter, part 2 is where the mud sticks to my boots, but the laughter begins to buy me bread. You've heard the first coin clink at my feet when the Lord tossed it, yes? Well, coins have a way of whispering promises louder than any priest's sermon. That little disc of silver rattled in my palm like a key, one that might open a door beyond our village, smoke and sorrow. But a coin doesn't change who you are overnight. I was still the ragged boy with patched breeches, still the butt of the reeve's curses, still the son of a mother too thin and a father too drunk. Yet something had shifted. I had seen a Lord laugh. Not just smirk, not sneer, but laugh, because of me. That a dangerous seed to plant in a boy's head. The first motley, I ever wore wasn't the fine patchwork you imagine, stitched from bright silks and jingling with bells. No, it was a disaster cobbled together from rags. My sisters pieced it for me after the midsummer fair, giggling as they patched together scraps of blue, red, and yellow cloth scavenged from laundry piles. They even sewed little tin buttons along the sleeves so they'd clink when I moved. I paraded about in that ridiculous outfit, a scarecrow pretending at grandeur, but to me it was armor. When I wore those scraps, I wasn't a hungry boy anymore. I was a performer. And people treat a performer differently. They laugh at your foolishness. Yes, but somehow it stings less than when they laugh at your poverty. You control the laughter. That makes all the difference. One evening, emboldened by my costume, I snuck into the tavern yard while the men drank. I mimicked the blacksmith's booming voice, then waddled like the reeve, then hiccuped like my father staggering home. For a moment, there was silence, too much silence, and I feared I'd crossed a line. Then the men broke into raucous laughter, pounding their mugs on the table, tossing me crusts of bread. Even the blacksmith chuckled, though the reeve turned a shade of purple that made me fear he'd burst. That night, my mother scolded me half to death, but she also tucked an extra crust under my blanket. That was her way of saying, "You're a fool, but perhaps a useful one." Word of my antics reached ears beyond the village. A steward from the Lord's Hall came one day, sniffing about like a hound. He asked questions, too many, and finally said the Lord wanted entertainment for his upcoming feast. Perhaps, the steward sneered, the dung-heap king can juggle more than 2 potatoes this time. Fear knotted my belly, but excitement burned hotter. To perform before villagers was one thing. To stand in the Lord's Hall, under banners and chandeliers, before knights and ladies, that was another world entirely. My mother fussed and fretted, scrubbing my hair until it shone, forcing me into my rag motley, though she muttered it looked shameful. "Remember," she whispered as she tied a scrap of rope around my waist for a belt, "jest upward, never downward, and bow lower than you jest." The hall was a cathedral of wood and stone to my eyes. I'd never seen such splendor. Tables groaning with meat and bread, goblets of silver, tapestries of battles I'd never heard of. The lords and ladies glittered like saints come to life, though I'd learn later that saints smell sweeter. The air was heavy with roasted boar, spiced wine, and sweat beneath velvet. I was shoved forward, trembling, while the reeve smirked from the corner. The Lord leaned back on his carved chair, a mastiff at his feet, and said, "Well, boy, show us what you are." What did I do? I panicked. My stones slipped from my sweaty palms, clattering to the floor. The hall erupted with jeers. My ears burned, my stomach twisted. For a moment, I wanted to run, to flee back to the dung heap. But desperation is a jester's ally. I dropped to all fours, scrambling after the stones like a hound, then pretended to bite one and bark. The mastiff perked up, tail wagging, and bounded over play. The lords roared with laughter at the sight of their fierce beast frolicking with a ragged fool. I leaned into it, rolling on my back, yelping, chasing my own tail until I collapsed in mock exhaustion. The hall thundered with applause. Even the Lord wiped tears from his eyes. That night, I didn't just walk home with another coin. I walked with the knowledge that I could survive anywhere, if only I dared to make a fool of myself. It wasn't long before the Lord offered me a place in his hall. Not as a servant in the kitchen, not as a field hand, but as a fool. Imagine that. Me, a fool by trade. My father spat when he heard it, growling that I'd shamed the family. But my mother, she kissed my forehead and said quietly, "Better a fool in a motley than a corpse in the ditch." I accepted. What choice did I have? The fields promised nothing but blisters and hunger. The church promised nothing but silence and Latin. The motley, for all its ridicule, promised survival. Yet here's the secret no one tells you. When you take the fool's bargain, you trade one kind of chains for another. You no longer fear the gallows, perhaps, but you live at the mercy of laughter. Fail to amuse, and you're worthless. Amuse too well, and you risk offense. You live forever on a knife's edge, bells tinkling as you dance. And I danced. The Lord Hall became my classroom. I learned quickly that lords laughed differently than peasants. Villagers loved slapstick, pratfalls, silly voices. But nobles wanted wit, mimicry, sly truths hidden in riddles. Too simple and they sneered. Too sharp and they glared. So I studied them. I watched how the steward puffed when praised, how the knight scratched his beard when lying, how the lady smirked when she thought no one noticed. Then I mirrored them, exaggerated them, teased them, never cruelly, always just shy of offense. One evening, I parroted the steward's pompous announcements, strutting about with a wine jug like it was a scroll. The hall erupted with laughter. The steward blanched, but the lord clapped. He has a tongue like a blade, the lord chuckled, but it cuts the right throats. That was my second lesson. The fool's real work isn't juggling or jest, it's observation. We're spies in plain sight, ears open, tongues sharp. We notice what others miss, and we say what others dare not, wrapped in the sugar of laughter. Not every jest landed so safely. One night, emboldened by too much ale, I mimicked the Lord himself, his haughty tilt of the chin, his deep booming laugh. For a heartbeat, the hall went silent, breath held. I thought I'd doomed myself. Then the Lord guffawed, pounding the table. "By God, he's got me," he roared. Laughter followed, nervous but relieved. My knees trembled, but I bowed low, bells jingling. Later that night, the steward hissed in my ear, "Another jest like that, and you'll find yourself in the stocks, or worse." That was my third lesson. Every fool carries two masters. The one who pays you, and the one who waits to punish you. Balance them, or you won't last long. And so my life as a jester truly began. Not on the dung heap, not in the village square, but in a hall thick with wine, power, and secrets. I had crossed the threshold. The boy was gone. In his place stood a fool, half proud, half terrified, and wholly bound to the dance of motley dreams. The first time I slept within the Lord's walls, I couldn't close my eyes. The bed wasn't a bed at all, just a pallet of straw in the corner near the kitchens. But to me it felt like heaven itself. No damp, no pigs rooting at my feet, no drunkards bellowing through the night. Only the crackle of embers and the hum of distant voices. I lay there staring at the rafters, my mind racing. I'd been plucked from the mud and set in a place of banners and torches. It was terrifying and it was intoxicating. You might think a fool is just another servant, lumped in with scullery maids and spit turners. But it's stranger than that. I was neither servant nor noble. I ate scraps from the Lord's table, better fare than I'd ever known, yet still scraps. I sat at the edge of feasts, close enough to jest, but never close enough to matter. I belonged everywhere and nowhere, tolerated because I made people laugh, despised because I reminded them of their own absurdity. The hall taught me quickly. To survive here, I had to be nimble not only with hands but with words. The steward barked orders like a general. The chamberlain swept about as if born from silk. The knights clattered in armor, boasting and jeering. They all carried pride sharp as daggers. One slip of the tongue could cut me in half. So I learned to bow lower than the lowest servant, then rise with a grin that unsettled even the haughtiest knight. I was harmless, yet not. Safe, yet not. That's the paradox of the fool. You're never what they expect, and that's what keeps you alive. A week into my service, the Lord held a banquet for visiting knights. My task, amuse them between courses. I was given no script, no guidance. Only the unspoken rule, succeed or disappear. I began with juggling, which went well enough. Then mimicry, which drew chuckles. But the true triumph came when I acted out a mock tourney. I tied a ladle to my arm as a sword, flipped a bucket upside down for a helm, and pranced about the hall challenging invisible foes. The knights roared with laughter, slapping the tables as I toppled over dramatically. At the end, I declared myself Sir Ladle of the Leaking Bucket, undefeated champion of puddles and pigs. The hall nearly shook from their amusement. Even the sternest knight, one who had glared at me all evening, spilled his wine laughing. From that night on, I wasn't just a novelty. I was the Lord's fool. The reeve, sour as vinegar, scowled whenever he saw me, but he no longer dared tug me by the ear. I had protection now, though protection in a lord's hall is as fragile as ice in spring. The hardest lesson for a jester is this: it isn't the trick, the tumble, or the song that makes people laugh. It's knowing when. A hall full of drunk knights will cheer if you fall flat on your face. But a hall tense with politics, with whispers of war or famine, will turn on you if you misstep. The same jest that delights one evening can condemn you the next. Timing is everything. So I became a student of faces. I studied how a smile could tighten at the edges when anger brewed beneath, how fingers drummed on the table when patience wore thin, how a glance could kill long before a blade was drawn. These were my texts, my scriptures. Others read psalms. I read smirks. I learned, too, that laughter has layers. A nobleman's laugh at a bawdy jest is not the same as a peasant's laugh at a pratfall. One is performance, the other release. My job was to give them both, switching masks, so quickly they never noticed the seams. I still remember the first time my tongue nearly cost me more than a cuff. It was winter, the hall cold enough to freeze ale in mugs. The Lord was in a foul mood, his taxes short, his neighbors defiant. Wine loosened his tongue, and he grumbled about how he'd deal with cowardly knaves who refused loyalty. Fool that I was, no, fool that I am. I piped up, "Cowardly knaves, my lord? Then I should be your general. None can out-coward me." The hall gasped. My heart lurched. Had I gone too far? Then the Lord's face cracked, slow as ice melting, into a smile. He laughed. Loud, booming real. "I fool," he said. "You'd rout them with nothing but your shrieks." The hall roared with him. I bowed so low my nose touched the floor, sweat dripping down my back. Inside, I trembled. That night, I learned another truth. Jesting with a lord's like juggling knives, thrilling, dangerous, and one slip away for blood. Not every day was feasting and folly. Much of court life was dull as mud. The ladies embroidered, the knights argued over hunting hounds, the steward nagged about accounts. My role was to cut through that monotony, to provide sparks in the gloom. Sometimes it was a song, sometimes a riddle. Sometimes all it took was falling off a bench at the right moment. But when laughter wasn't needed, I vanished. That's another paradox. Fools shine brightest in bursts, but too much of us and the shine fades. So I learned invisibility, lingering in shadows, listening more than speaking. That habit served me well. I became a collector of secrets, lovers' trysts, knights' debts, the steward's grumbling, all whispered within reach of my ears, for who notices a fool loitering in a corner? And while I rarely spoke these secrets aloud, knowing them gave me power. The jester may be lowly, but knowledge can make him taller than any knight. Perhaps the strangest part of my new life was the freedom of speech. Peasants bowed and scraped, servants bit their tongues, but I could speak truths others dared not. I could mock a knight's swagger, question a lady's gossip, even parody the Lord himself, so long as I wrapped it in laughter. It was a curious power, like being allowed to wear a crown made of paper. Flimsy, fragile, but still a crown. People feared me in small ways, for I might make them ridiculous before the hall. And they respected me in stranger ways, for I could say aloud what they only whispered. But it was a thin privilege, dependent on the Lord's mood. One scowl could snuff it out forever. So I wore it lightly, bells jingling, always aware that beneath the laughter lay danger sharp as any blade. Those first months in the court were the forging of me. I entered trembling, a boy in rags pretending at motley. I emerged a jester, still trembling but with a sharper grin, armed not with swords or armor but with words, mimicry, and the strange permission to dance upon the knife's edge of power. I had found my place, not secure, never secure, but a place nonetheless. And though I often longed for the simplicity of dung heaps and village fairs, I knew there was no going back. Once you've worn motley in a hall of lords, you are bound to it forever. To be a fool in a lord's hall is one thing. To be a fool tethered to a king, or one who might as well be king in his own domain, is another beast entirely. When I say shadow, I mean it. I could not breathe without measuring his mood, could not laugh without weighing his frown. Where he went, I followed, bells tinkling like the chains they truly were. The Lord, my master, my jailer, my audience, like me close. A fool is worth little if he isn't at my elbow, he'd say, and so at his elbow I sat. At table, during hunts, even at councils of war, where matters far above my head are discussed, I was there. A jest when tempers flared, a mimicry when silence grew heavy, a pratfall when boasts turned to quarrels. It sounds grand, doesn't it? To sit beside power, to drink wine when others gnawed stale crusts. But make no mistake, the nearer you sit to the fire, the quicker you burn. He had moods, that lord of mine, storms behind his eyes. When he laughed, I was safe. When he brooded, my tongue grew clumsy and my bells heavy. Sometimes, for no reason at all, his gaze would turn to me and I would feel smaller than a flea on a hound's back. A fool is protected by laughter, yes, but when laughter dies, so does protection. There's an old saying, only two may speak truth to a king, the priest and the fool. The priest couches it in scripture, the fool wraps it in jest. I discovered this the day and night, broad as an ox, drunk as a barrel, boasted of his victories and belittled his fellows. The hall simmered with resentment, yet no one dared challenge him. So I leapt onto the table, snatched a chicken leg, and waved it like a sword. Behold, I cried, mimicking the knight's swagger. Another foe defeated by Sir Drumstick. Hide, ladies, lest he joust your hens. The hall exploded with laughter. The knight turned red, ready to strike me, but the lord bellowed, enough. Sit, you puffed rooster. The fool has skewered you truer than any lance. That was when I realized the strange privilege I held. I could say what others thought, but swallowed. I could prick pride, topple arrogance, reveal truths cloaked in wine. But it was a privilege built on sand. One misstep, and the same jest that amused today could condemn tomorrow. My shadowing did not end in the hall. On hunts, I trotted behind, panting as nobles spurred their horses after deer. I was expected to fall into ditches, to mimic hounds, to cheer the Lord's arrow whether it struck true or not. Once, I slipped in the mud and landed face first in a puddle just as the Lord missed his quarry. He roared with laughter, declaring my tumble better than the deer. I was drenched, filthy, but alive and in his favor. At war, the jest turned darker. Fools were dragged on campaigns, not for amusement alone, but for morale. I sang of victories before they were won, mocked the enemy as cowards, juggled stones while men sharpened steel. Soldiers clung to my antics like men to fire in winter. For if the fool could laugh, perhaps death wasn't so close. Yet I also saw things no minstrel would sing. Fields of corpses, villages burned, men weeping for lost sons. What jest could salve that? I tried, God knows I tried, but sometimes the laughter I coaxed felt more like a sob strangled into disguise. Favor with a king, or near enough to one, is a fickle thing. One day, he would drape an arm across my shoulders, declaring me worth more than a dozen knights. The next, he'd glare as though I'd poison his wine. Once, after a council where his advisers urged taxes the peasants could not bear, I quipped, "Careful, my lord, lest your people crown the reeve in dung instead of gold." The hall chuckled nervously. The lord's face froze. For 3 days, he did not summon me. I thought my end had come, that I would be whipped, banished, or worse. Then, on the 4th day, he called me to his chamber, tossed me a coin, and muttered, "You speak too much truth, fool. But perhaps that's why I keep you. Do you see the madness of it? One moment, I was a treasure. The next, a liability. And I never knew which until it was too late. At night, when the hall grew quiet and even the steward's quill scratched no more, I lay awake listening to my own heartbeat. The bells on my cap seemed to echo in the darkness. I thought of my mother's warning, jest upward, never downward, and never at the wrong moment. But how does one know the right moment when shadows shift like smoke? I told myself I was clever, that I could always dance on the edge. Yet deep down, I knew one day the laughter would fail me, and when it did, the shadow of the king would fall heavy indeed. To live as a fool in a king's shadow is to carry both a crown and coffin on your head. Crown, because you wield a freedom none else dare claim. Coffin, because that freedom can kill you if mishandled. I walked that line every day, bells jangling, smiles painted, heart pounding. And though fear was my constant companion, I would not trade it. For what is life but shadow and jest, fear and laughter twined together? If you want to know the heartbeat of a court, don't watch its councils or its wars. Watch its feasts. A lord's hall was never more alive than when torches blazed, platters steamed, and ale flowed like rivers. For the knights, it was a chance to boast. For the ladies, a chance to shine. For the lord, a chance to remind everyone of his power. And for me, feasts were both my stage and my trial by fire. Picture it, trestle tables stretching the length of the hall, groaning under roasted boars, fish glazed with honey, trenchers piled high with bread. The air is thick with grease and spice, sweat and smoke. Dogs skulking under benches, children darting between serving maids, musicians fiddling in a corner. And then me, the fool, a motley scrap of color weaving through all that splendor. My cue was never formal. I didn't have a place on the musician's roster or the steward's ledger. My cue was the moment the laughter lulled, when the air grew heavy with the scrape of knives and the crunch of bones. That's when the Lord would glance my way, a flicker of boredom in his eye. That was my signal. Make them laugh, fool, before silence swallows the hall. Sometimes I sang. Sometimes I juggled apples until one split and sprayed juice across the table. Sometimes I mimicked the guests, the knight who slurped his soup, the lady who sighed too loudly at every jest. Safe targets, never too sharp. But other times, those were the nights. They wanted folly laced with danger. A feast could turn in an instant. A jest that soared one night could sink the next, all depending on wine, pride, and hunger. Improvisation was survival. Once, a drunken knight challenged another to an arm wrestle, the table creaking beneath their bulk. Sensing tension, I leapt up, planted myself between them, and declared, "Why test strength with arms when bellies are better suited?" Then I puffed mine out and dared them to wrestle me with their stomachs. The hall roared. The knights forgot their quarrel and, laughing, joined in my nonsense until we were all gasping for breath. That's what they never tell you about fools. Half our art is distraction. We weren't just there to entertain. We were there to defuse, to redirect, to turn quarrels into jokes before blades were drawn. But it cut both ways. A joke too sharp, and you could start a quarrel instead of ending one. I remember one winter feast when the Lord, flushed with wine, boasted of his hunting prowess. He claimed he'd slain 3 boars with a single arrow. Everyone nodded, though we all knew it was nonsense. I should have kept my tongue behind my teeth. But the fire and the ale and the roar of the hall pushed me onward. I snatched a pig's head from the platter, balanced it on my shoulder, and cried, "Behold, my lord's 3 boars, slain with one shot, the arrow of his tongue." For a heartbeat, silence, the kind that curdles blood. Then the Lord's eyes narrowed. My stomach turned to ice. Had I overstepped? And then he burst into laughter. "A sharp-tongued arrow indeed," he bellowed. The hall followed, relief spilling into guffaws. My knees nearly buckled with the weight of my escape. But that night alone I trembled. One wrong breath, and the laughter could have turned to fury. That was the fire I danced with every feast. Sometimes folly was literal fire. One midsummer, eager to impress visiting lords, I decided to juggle torches. I had seen traveling jongler do it, and I thought, why not me? Fool's thinking. The first toss went well enough. The second singed my sleeve. By the third, one torch slipped, landed on a tapestry, and set the whole thing ablaze. Panic surged. Servants dashed with buckets. Knights cursed. Ladies shrieked. I stood frozen, certain my death was sealed. Then, instinct. I grabbed a pitcher of ale and doused the flame, sputtering foam everywhere. The hall fell silent, smoke curling in the air. And then, laughter. First a snicker, then a roar. The Lord slapped the table, gasping. Only my fool would nearly burn the hall to prove he can juggle. They laughed until tears streamed down their faces. And me? I laughed too, though my heart pounded like a drum. I had danced with fire and lived. But I never touched a torch again without a bucket close by. Here's what I came to understand. In those halls, I wasn't just a clown. I was the chorus to their play, the echo to their boasts, the mirror that distorted but revealed. They needed me more than they admitted. Without me, feasts could turn sour, too heavy, too solemn, too violent. With me, quarrels softened, boredom vanished, pride was pricked just enough to let air out before it burst. I was the grease in the gears, the spark in the gloom, the fool who made folly a shield for the whole hall. And though I was never given a seat of honor, I knew I was indispensable. In their laughter, I heard my survival. In their folly, I found my purpose. When I recall those feasts, I don't think of the food or the banners. I think of the faces, the lords flushed with wine, the knights split by laughter, the lady hiding a grin behind her goblet. And I think of myself, cap askew, bells jingling, heart racing with every jest. Feast, fire, folly, they were all the same in the end. Fuel for laughter. And laughter was my bread, my shield, my crown. For all the splendor of a lord's hall, I'll confess a secret. My heart beat louder in the alehouse. The hall gave me safety and coin, but the tavern gave me life. Nobles laughed to flatter themselves, but villagers, farmers, peddlers, beggars, washerwomen, they laughed because they needed to. Their laughter wasn't gilded. It was raw, raucous, sometimes cruel, sometimes sweet, but always real. Whenever the Lord's business took him riding through his lands, I tagged along, his jingling pet. And when he stopped at an inn or allowed his retinue to scatter for the evening, that's when I found myself drawn back to the smoky corners of the alehouse. The floors were sticky with spilled ale, the benches crowded with rough shoulders, the air heavy with sweat, smoke, and roasting meat. No polished tapestries here, no silver goblets, just clay mugs and the clatter of dice. And yet, when I leapt on a table to jest, the cheer that met me was stronger than any applause in the Lord's hall. They didn't want subtlety, no clever riddles, no barbed mimicry of politics. They wanted pratfalls, bawdy songs, jokes about the Reeve's missing teeth or the miller's daughter's wandering skirts. So I gave it to them. And oh, how they laughed. The sound shook the rafters, shook me right down to the marrow. You have to understand, I was paid in more than coins in those places. Alehouses gave me bread, tankards of frothing beer, even the occasional kiss from a barmaid who liked my antics. More importantly, they gave me safety. Villagers who knew me as the fool would sometimes shield me, slipping me out the back when tempers flared, warning me when a man had had too much ale to take a joke. It was a strange sort of currency. The Lord's coin kept me clothed, but the villagers' laughter kept me alive. But don't mistake it, all was not cheer and clapping. In the alehouse, the line between beloved trickster and despised nuisance was thinner than a hair. Once, in a packed tavern, I sang a crude song about the Reeve's fondness for hoarding grain. The crowd howled with delight, until the Reeve himself stormed in. His face purple, his fists clenched. He grabbed me by the collar and hissed that one more jest like that would see me whipped. The crowd fell silent. My heart hammered, and then I laughed. I twisted his fury into a performance, bowing low, kissing his hand, declaring him the patron saint of empty barns. The crowd erupted again, this time at his expense. He released me, humiliated, and stormed out. I was saved, but only just. That's how it was in taverns. One moment they adored you. The next they'd string you up if you touched the wrong pride. I learned to read those runes faster than any hall. Villages, too, became my stage. At harvest fairs, I'd tumble in the dirt, juggle apples, sing parodies of saints. Children flocked to me, farmers chuckled, even beggars tossed me a crust as thanks for a smile. But villages were harsher judges than nobles. Nobles expected folly, they paid for it. Villagers saw through you. If your jest didn't land, if your tricks faltered, they wouldn't laugh politely. They'd boo. They'd throw cabbage. Once a fish, I smelled of river for days after. And yet, when it worked, when I struck the right chord, it was pure. Laughter that shook ribs, laughter that lifted the weight of the plow and the tax. That was worth every cabbage to the head. I'd be lying if I told you every tavern night ended well. Ale loosens tempers as easily as it loosens tongues. More than once I found myself cornered by a man who didn't like my mimicry of his limp or the way I sang about his wife's cooking. Once, a brawl erupted after a jest I made about a knight's prowess in bed. He lunged for me, but the crowd turned on him, half defending me, half simply eager for a fight. Tankards flew, benches toppled, blood spilled. I crawled under a table, bells jingling, praying to every saint I knew. By morning, the tavern was wrecked, the night gone, and me alive, somehow. That was the lesson of taverns. They love their fools, but they could kill them too. When I think of those days, I see more than just laughter. I see the flicker of torches on ale-slick tables, hear the roar of peasants drunk on brief escape, feel the sting of a thrown cabbage and the warmth of a barmaid's kiss. The hall gave me a position. The tavern gave me soul. Between them, I lived, half in silk shadows, half in smoky firelight, always balancing, always performing, always a fool. A knight had his sword, a monk his scriptures, a blacksmith his hammer. Me? I had my arsenal too, though mine was stranger, a bundle of tricks, toys, and words sharper than steel. Call it a fool's armory. It weighed nothing, cost little, but it kept me alive in halls and hovels alike. My first weapons were stones, snatched from the roadside. A poor boy's toys, but with practice they became something greater. I learned to keep 3 in the air, then 4. Apples, onions, even tankards when the ale was low enough. Nobles clapped politely. Villagers howled when one smacked me in the nose. That was the thing. Perfection bored them. A stumble, a bruise, a stone bouncing off my head. That's what earned the roar. Later, I graduated to knives. Foolish, yes, but fools thrive on foolishness. To toss 3 blades in the torchlight and snatch them by the hilt. Ah, that drew gasps. The risk was half the trick. One slip and I'd have split my skull. But danger sweetens laughter like spice sweetens meat. Among my arsenal was a puppet carved from wood, painted with a crooked grin. I called him Little Jack. He spoke when I could not, mocked when I dare not. I'd perch him on my shoulder, squawk in a falsetto, and let him insult knights and ladies with impunity. Little Jack once called the steward a goat with quills for horns. The hall laughed, the steward seethed, and I bowed innocently. Not I, my lord, but Jack. That was the puppet's genius. He was my scapegoat. But even puppets court peril. One evening, Jack mocked the Lord himself, his girth, to be exact. The hall froze. My heart stopped. Then the Lord wheezed with laughter, jabbing a finger at the puppet. He dares what even you do not, fool, he roared. From then on, Jack was safer than I was. Words were weapons too. I kept a sack of riddles in my head, some old as Rome, some I invented on the spot. What walks on 4 legs at dawn, 2 at noon, and none at night? I'd ask, stealing from the Greeks, watching the nobles puzzle while peasants shrugged. Songs were sharper still. Bawdy ballads for taverns, sweet rhymes for children, parodies for halls. Once I rewrote a hymn into a ditty about the cook's stew. It spread through the kitchens until even the priest hummed it. He scowled when he realized. Rhymes made memory. A just told plain might fade, but wrap it in rhyme and it stuck like burrs on wool. That's why fools were feared. Our songs lingered long after the feast ended, echoing in our ears, carrying truths no one wanted sung. Then there was slapstick, crude but eternal. A bladder on a stick, thwacking a knight's rump, earned laughter no matter the hall. Mock duels with ladles, pratfalls downstairs, exaggerated bowing until my nose kissed the floor, all part of the craft. I learned to turn humiliation into art. A stumble wasn't failure, it was performance. A beating wasn't shame, it was spectacle. Pain became punchline. My bruises were badges, my limps encores. Strange, isn't it, to live a life where suffering is coin? But that was my arsenal too. Not all tools were in my hands. Some were on my face. I owned masks, grotesque, comic, tragic, fashioned from leather and cloth. With them, I could become anyone, the gossiping maid, the greedy reeve, the bumbling knight. Masks freed me. Behind them, I could say what I dared not as myself. Yet the truest mask was my own grin. Painted, forced, endless. It was my shield, my weapon, my disguise. No matter what fear gnawed inside, I wore a smile. That was the fool's greatest trick, convincing the world he laughed even when he bled. When I think of my arsenal, I see more than props. I see survival. Each stone juggled, each rhyme recited, each pratfall and puppet. They were the blades and bucklers of my trade. Knights fought with steel. I fought with laughter. And more often than not, my weapons proved sharper. A fool alone is never truly alone. We were many, though scattered, like sparks from the same fire. Minstrels, jongler, tumblers, tricksters, mummers, and fools. We all prowled the same roads, halls, and taverns. And though we shared the trade of laughter, we were rivals as much as kin. In a world where laughter was scarce coin, every chuckle, every clap, every tossed crust could mean the difference between a full belly and an empty night. The first rivals I truly noticed were the jongler. Slim, nimble, their fingers dancing on lutes and harps, voices smooth as honey. Where I juggled stones, they juggled notes. They could charm a hall with a ballad of knights and maidens while I banged pots on my head for a laugh. I envied them. I'll not deny it. Their craft seemed noble, their art refined. But then I saw their faces when the crowd laughed louder at my pratfall than at their polished tune. Music may stir hearts, but laughter owns them. That's when I knew we competed not just for coin, but for souls. Minstrels carried news as well as songs, and that gave them weight. They were welcomed at courts, for they brought tidings of wars and weddings. Yet even they gritted their teeth when the Lord leaned forward and said, "Sing later, let the fool jest now." Then there were the mummers, mask-wearing, role-shifting troops who performed whole plays in village squares. They mocked kings and saints alike, their pageantry wild and bawdy. I admired them, even borrowed from them, though they borrowed from us fools too. But when mummers arrived in a town where I was working, I might as well have packed my bells and gone. Crowds swarmed their stages, left me juggling apples to children only half watching. I hated them for that, even as I loved their chaos. Rivals, yes, but also teachers. I studied their rhythm, their daring, and stitched it into my own motley. And of course, there were fools like me. Motley clad, bell jingling, tongue sharp. Meeting another fool was like staring into a warped mirror. We measured each other instantly. Wit against wit, trick against trick. Once in a market town, I met a fool called Hob. He juggled 7 knives, sang 3 verses at once, and mocked me mercilessly. The crowd adored him. I burned with jealousy, then turned it into fuel. I leapt atop a barrel, mocked Hob's crooked teeth, and tumbled into the mud. The crowd howled louder than they had for him. Afterward, we drank together. Rivals on the stage, comrades by the fire. That was the way of fools. We fought for laughter but shared the loneliness behind it. As my name grew, so too did the boys who tried to follow me. Some begged to carry my things, hoping to learn. I took a few on, teaching them to juggle, to rhyme, to read a room. Apprentices, though none would admit it openly. But for every true apprentice, there were 3 copycats. Lads who painted their faces, stuck feathers in caps, and called themselves fools without earning the bells. They mimicked my tricks poorly, repeated my jokes badly. I hated them more than rivals, for they cheapened the craft. And yet, wasn't I once a boy on a dung heap, mimicking others? Perhaps I hated them because they reminded me of my own beginnings. Competition sharpened me. Knowing another fool might steal my place at a feast, or that a minstrel might outshine me with song, kept me restless, inventive. I learned to never repeat a jest too often, to always twist a trick into something new. Stagnation meant death in our trade. But rivalry also weighed heavy. I remember lying awake, hearing the crowd's laughter still echo for another man, wondering if tomorrow I'd be forgotten. For fools live only as long as they're remembered. When laughter fades, so does the fool. When I think of rivals now, I don't feel the heat of envy so much as the warmth of kinship. We were all scrabbling for the same scraps, all dancing the same dangerous dance. Some bested me, some I bested. But together we kept the fire of folly alive in a world that sorely needed it. Rivals, apprentices, pretenders, they shaped me as surely as hunger and hull. Without them, I'd have grown dull. With them, I was sharpened, honed, forged into the fool I became. They think fools know nothing of love. They look at the bells on our caps, the painted grin, the pratfalls, and they imagine a heart as hollow as a bladder stick. But let me tell you this, the fool laughs loudest when his heart aches most. Behind every painted smile lies hunger, not only for bread or coin, but for touch, for warmth, for someone to look at you and not see just the motley. My first tastes of love were hardly love at all. Barmaids with quick hands and quicker laughter would pull me into shadowed corners after a night's jesting. A kiss traded for a song, a squeeze for a rhyme. Nothing lasting, just sparks in the dark. They liked me because I was funny, because I could make their dull nights brighter. I liked them because, for a moment, they didn't see a fool, they saw a man. But morning always told the truth. The barmaid turned back to her trays. I pulled on my bells, and we went our separate ways. Love in taverns is like spilled ale, sweet while it lasts, sticky after. It was different in the hall. There was a lady, young, clever, with eyes like summer sky. She laughed at my jest not politely, but truly, the kind that shakes shoulders. And in her laughter, I felt seen. Not as entertainment, not as ornament, but as someone. Fools have no right to noble hearts, yet mine betrayed me. I found myself weaving jests meant only for her, sneaking glances, bowing lower at her presence. Once, I sang a song of a caged bird longing for open skies. The hall roared at the comedy of my flapping arms, but her eyes softened, and I knew she understood the cage was me. But what chance had I? A fool and a lady? My motley was both armor and barrier. We danced only in glances, and laughter shared too long. Perhaps that was safer, for had I reached further, it would have meant ruin for us both. Not all affairs ended in glances. I knew fools who dallied with maids, even ladies bold enough to risk scandal. Some thrived in such liaisons, shielded by their patrons. Others were whipped, banished, even hanged. I myself once stumbled into scandal. A knight's wife, lonely and sharp-tongued, drew me into her chambers with promises of wine. I was young, foolish, flattered. We kissed, we tumbled, and for a week I thought myself blessed. Then the night returned. Whisper spread. The lady laughed it off, claiming I was merely practicing a jest. The hall believed, or pretended to. The knight never spoke of it, but his eyes burned whenever they met mine. I expected his blade in my back at any feast. It never came, but neither did sleep for many nights. That was when I learned love for a fool is perilous. Desire may warm you briefly, but it can freeze your soul with fear after. And yet, for all the dalliances and stolen moments, the deepest truth is this: the fool is lonely. Our role is to be everyone's companion, but no one's equal. We jest with lords, drink with peasants, flirt with maids, but we belong to none. When laughter fades and the hall grows quiet, we return to pallets of straw, to silence. Lovers drift away, barmaids find sturdier men, ladies marry knights. And the fool remains, grinning in the dark, listening to his own bells. It is the cruelest jest of all, that the one who makes others laugh most often weeps alone. Do not pity me too much. I had kisses, I had warmth, I had moments when hearts met, if only for a breath. But love for a fool is never steady. It is a passing flame, a flicker behind the painted smile. And perhaps that is fitting. We live in fragments, in bursts of laughter and fleeting folly. Why should our loves be any different? Still, I sometimes wonder what it would have been to lay aside the motley, to be seen not as a fool, but as a man. Laughter may have been my bread, but it never filled my belly by itself. Behind every jest, behind every painted grin, there was always the same gnawing question. How much coin will they throw this time? And will it be enough to keep me alive until the next feast? A fool's wage was never steady. Nobles tossed me coins when my jest pleased them, but it was whim, not wage. Some nights, I'd earn a silver penny, more than a plowman might see in a week. Other times, nothing but bones stripped clean from the feast, tossed to me with the dogs. And yet, scraps from a lord's table were riches compared to village life. Roasted boar, bread soft as clouds, fish dripping with butter. What did it matter if I ate it crouched by the fire while the knights dined at table? Hunger made no complaint, but scraps come with shame. To be laughed at is one thing. To be laughed at while gnawing bones like a hound is another. Still, I licked the marrow clean. Pride does not fill the stomach. When I did earn coins, they never stayed long in my pouch. Alehouses have a way of calling to fools. Perhaps it was the firelight, perhaps the cheer, perhaps the chance to be loved by strangers for the cost of a song. I'd swagger in, bells jingling, pockets heavy for once, and leave at dawn with nothing but a hangover and bruised ribs from some brawl I barely remembered. Coins melted in my hands. A new puppet here, a painted mask there, wagers on dice, favors to barmaids. I told myself it was investment, tools of the trade, building goodwill. But truth be told, I spent like a fool because fools live as though tomorrow may not come. And often it didn't. Debt was as much a companion to me as my bells. I borrowed from innkeepers, from fellow performers, even once from the reeve himself, though I regretted it before the ink dried on his ledger. I paid back in jests, in performances, in promises. Let me perform at your feast, and I'll clear what I owe. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. A fool's word is worth little to men who measure only in coin. I've dodged more than one cudgel swung by a man tired of waiting for his money. And then there was wine. At first, it was part of the show. Nobles shoved goblets into my hands, laughing to see me gulp and stagger. But soon I found I craved it even when no one watched. Wine dulled the edge of fear, blurred the memory of loneliness. But wine is no friend. It loosened my tongue too far, made me jest too sharply, stumble too clumsily. More than once I awoke with a bruised face, the memory of some ill-placed joke as hazy as the dregs in my cup. A sober fool is dangerous enough. A drunk fool is a corpse waiting to be claimed. People imagine fools clothed in bright, motley stitched of silks. They forget who pays for it. I did with my hard-won coins. Motley wore out quickly, bells broke, mask split. To appear ragged was to risk scorn. So I patched and repatched, begged scraps from seamstresses, painted over holes with dyes stolen from kitchens. Once, a noble tossed me a length of fine cloth after a jest pleased him. I turned it into a cap with bells, proud as a king with a crown. But the next week, I pawned it for ale. Such is the cycle of fools. We trade our crowns for cups. No matter how many coins I earned, no matter how many feasts I performed, one was always with me. One of food, one of rest, one of love. The hall gave me scraps, the tavern gave me warmth, but hunger, hunger of every kind, never left. It's a cruel truth. The fool who makes others forget their misery carries his own doubled. I laughed for lords and peasants alike, but inside I worried about the next meal, the next debt, the next night alone with nothing but my bells for company. Wine, wages, want. They were my true companions, more faithful than any lord or lady. They taught me harsh lessons. That coin is fleeting, that wine is poison, that want is eternal. And yet, without them, would I have been a fool at all? Perhaps not. Perhaps folly is born not from plenty, but from hunger. And hunger, I knew it well. Of all the tools in a fool's arsenal, satire was the sharpest. Stones bruised, puppets mocked, songs amused, but satire? Satire cut. It was the dagger I hid in my jests, the weapon that let me wound the proud without drawing blood. But every blade has two edges. With satire, I could protect myself. With satire, I could do myself too. In the Lord's hall, no one else could say what I could. Knights flattered, stewards lied, priests preached, but the fool laughed. And in that laughter, I slipped truths too dangerous to say aloud. When the tax collectors came boasting of their fair tallies, I juggled empty purses and cried, "Behold, the Lord's coffers, fat with air." The peasants laughed nervously, the nobles shifted in their seats, but the Lord chuckled, and that made it safe. When a pompous knight droned on about honor, I'm on polishing his boots with my tongue. The hall erupted, the knight flushed, and the Lord clapped. Truth, hidden in jest, survived because it wore motley. But satire was always a gamble. One word too sharp, and laughter curdled into fury. Once, after the Lord ordered a cruel punishment on a farmer who could not pay his rent, I sang a song. A Lord so strong, he wrestles the weak, a champion of coin, not of the meek. The hall gasped. I froze, bells trembling. The Lord's face darkened, and then, slowly, he laughed. "Sing it again, fool," he said, and louder. So I did. The hall joined in, mocking him in his own hall with his blessing. But I knew I had brushed death that night. One less drop of wine in his cup, and he might have had me whipped instead. That's the nature of satire. One night it wins you favor, the next it wins you a noose. Even priests were not immune. The church despised fools, yet it used us too. They thundered about sin while slipping coin into our hands to enliven their festivals. I mocked them because the people longed to see them mocked. I once parroted a bishop's sermon, wagging my finger, chanting gibberish Latin until the crowd collapsed in laughter. The bishop fumed but could do nothing. The Lord himself wheezed with mirth. That day, my satire shielded the hall from the weight of piety. But I never pushed too far. To jest at a priest's greed was one thing. To mock God outright was another. Fools had some license, but even motley could not protect against the church's wrath. There were nights satire saved me. When knights taunted me for my ragged motley, I mocked their rusted armor. When the steward scolded me for laziness, I mimed his quill scratching until smoke rose from the page. The crowd turned on him, and I was safe. Satire gave me teeth. It made me more than a plaything. It reminded them all that though I was lowest in rank, I was highest in freedom of speech. That frightened them more than my juggling ever could. But satire also weighed heavy. I carried truths no one else dared speak. I watched cruelty, greed, hypocrisy, and turned it into laughter. They laughed, yes, but when the laughter faded, the cruelty remained. Sometimes I wondered if my satire changed anything at all. Did mocking the steward's greed make him kinder? No. Did mocking the Lord's taxes ease the peasant's hunger? No. My satire soothed the hall, but it rarely cured. And in knowing that, I felt the weight of a clown who holds a mirror yet cannot break it. Still, satire was my survival. It gave me power where I had none, a voice where I should have been silent. It kept me alive in courts where silence killed faster than swords. And though it often stung me as much as it stung others, I would not have set it aside. For in satire lies the truth of the fool. We are not jesters of nonsense, but jesters of truth disguised. And sometimes, just sometimes, that truth, hidden in laughter, was enough to keep both me and the hall alive. War is no place for a fool, and yet fools were dragged there all the same. Where the Lord went, I followed, whether into feast or into fire. I had no sword, no armor, only bells and a sharp tongue, but they claimed I was needed. Needed, they said, to keep men laughing when death marched close. Imagine that. Laughter as armor. A thin shield indeed. I remember the first campaign I joined. The banners fluttered, the horses snorted, the men boasted of glory to come. And me? I trailed behind on a mule, motley clashing against the dull gray of armor. They jeered at me. "Keep up, fool." But their eyes softened when I sang. I made verses about their blisters, their stinking feet, their endless complaints. They laughed, and for a mile or two, the march felt lighter. But laughter didn't fill bellies. When bread ran out, when water turned foul, when men staggered from exhaustion, my jests fell flat. Try juggling stones for men whose stomachs gnawed themselves. The silence that met me then was heavier than any chain. The night before battle, though, that was my true work. Men sat by the fires, sharpening blades, whispering prayers. Fear hung thicker than smoke. That's when they dragged me forward. "Sing, fool. Yist. Make us forget what waits." So I did. I juggled helmets, mocked the enemy, sang songs of victory not yet won. I stumbled and tumbled until even the most terrified knight snorted into his ale. For a moment, their shoulders eased, and I knew my role. I was not there to fight. I was there to remind them they were still alive before dawn came to claim them. When the horns sounded and the lines clashed, I stayed behind, but not safe. Fools were expected to follow close, to rally, to jeer at the enemy. I shouted insults, waved flags, even juggled stones to mock the foe. But I saw too much. I saw men split open, heard screams that still ring in my ears. Once, a dying soldier clutched my sleeve and begged me to make him laugh one last time. I juggled 3 stones, dropped one on my head, and he smiled and stilled. That moment has never left me. Lords loved when I mocked their foes. I sang songs of cowardly knights, of kings who wet themselves in fear. It stirred our men, shamed theirs. Once, after a skirmish, I pranced about wearing a captured helm too large for me, tripping over it to roars of laughter. But such satire had cost. If captured, a fool who mocked the enemy rarely lived long. I knew this. Every jest hurled across the field was a wager with death. After the battle, I was called upon again. Men wounded, groaning, the field littered with corpses. What use was a fool then? Yet they summoned me, and I tried. I sang soft songs, told riddles to children clinging to mothers, mimicked the priest until even the grieving managed to smile. But inside I felt hollow. What jest can stand against the stench of blood? What laughter can lift a man who has lost his son? And yet I performed because that was my place. War taught me the deepest cruelty of folly, that even in mud and blood, men demanded laughter. That laughter was not joy, but survival, a thin thread keeping them from breaking. I was no knight, no soldier, yet war scarred me as surely as them. My bells jingled in fields where prayers turned to screams. My jests echoed in places where silence would have been more holy. And still, they laughed because they had to. The church never quite knew what to make of us fools. One day, they called us instruments of the devil, mocking the sacred. The next, they paid us in coin and bread to liven their holy festivals. We danced on the knife edge between saint and sinner, blessed and cursed, holy parody and profane necessity. From boyhood, I remember the priest scowling at me. My mimicry of his sermons earned me cuffs to the ear, yet even he sometimes hid a smile behind his hand. That was the way of the church. Denounce us in daylight, chuckle at us in secret. They could not resist laughter any more than a drunkard could resist ale. But in their sermons, we were devils in motley, tempters, distractions, sinners leading souls astray. The fool mocks God's order. They thundered, and laughter is the devil's breath. I laughed anyway, and yet, every winter, the same priests crowned us kings. The Feast of Fools, the holy day, turned upside down. The lowest rose, the highest fell. Boys dressed as bishops, priests brayed like asses, and fools, fools, ruled the church for a day. I once sat in the bishop's chair wearing a mitre made of pigskin, blessing the congregation with sausages. The people howled, the priests pretended outrage, and for one wild day, the sacred became profane. That was the church's hypocrisy. They condemned us, yet they needed us to release the pressure, to give the flock one day to laugh at their shepherds. I often parroted hymns, turning solemn chants into bawdy rhymes. The people loved it. The priests fumed, but they dared not silence me when the Lord himself laughed. Once, during Lent, I sang a ditty about fasting that ended with a fool sneaking sausages under his cap. The hall roared. The priest glared, but even he could not resist a twitch of his lips. Satire thrived best when cloaked in piety's shadow. Some priests took pity. I recall one friar who pressed bread into my hands and whispered, "Your laughter is not sin, boy, it is medicine." Another spat at me, calling me spawn of hell. I carried both words in my heart. Perhaps laughter is both healing and damning. Perhaps fools walk between heaven and hell, neither claimed fully by either. At festivals, fools often mingled with saints. We paraded relics, we mocked miracles. I once carried a chicken bone, declaring it the shin of Saint Crispin, and the crowd nearly choked with laughter. The priest scolded me, but the people remembered the laugh longer than his sermon. We reminded them that holiness could be heavy, but laughter made it bearable. That was our sin and our grace. When I think of saints and sinners now, I see myself caught between them. A sinner in motley, a saint when laughter healed a weary soul. The church scowled, the people laughed, and I danced between them, never fully belonging to either. Perhaps that is the fool's true place. Not heaven, not hell, but the narrow road between, paved with bells and jests, where saints and sinners both must walk. Some say fools were mad from the start. Others say the motley makes you mad in the end. I've lived long enough in bells and pain to know both can be true. Wear the cap too long, and it becomes your crown. Grin too often, and you forget whether the smile is yours or the mask's. Not every fool was like me, trained in jest. Some were born different, bent backs, twisted legs, faces marked by God's strange hand. The courts called them natural fools. Lords kept them like curiosities, pets in human form. They laughed at their oddities, not their wit. I pitied them, yet I envied them too. They were safe in a way. Their deformity was their motley. They could not be punished for folly when folly was written on their bodies. My folly, sharp and deliberate, was far more dangerous. Even for the clever fool, madness creeps in. Try it yourself. Spend your life laughing when you want to weep, mocking when you want to pray, juggling when your arms ache, bowing when you want to curse. Day after day, year after year. At some point, the mask sticks. There were nights I stared at my reflection in a bucket of water and wondered whose face I saw, the man beneath or the fool painted on top. The grin looked wrong, without paint, the eyes too tired for mirth. Sometimes I laughed just to hear it, to remind myself I still could. The sound frightened me more than silence. I knew fools who cracked under the weight. One, a brilliant wit, began laughing at nothing, howling in corners until the hall hushed in fear. Another wandered off mid-performance, muttering that God whispered jokes to him. They called it madness, locked them away, or let them wander as holy fools. I understood them. Laughter, wielded too long, becomes a poison. A jest meant to wound others can turn inward, slicing the jester himself. That's why I clung to masks. Leather faces painted with grotesque smiles, animal snouts, or saints' halos. When I wore them, I could be someone else. The mask carried the burden, not me. Behind it, I could mock, rage, weep, and no one knew. But masks are dangerous too. Wear one long enough, and you forget how to remove it. I found myself grinning in sleep, lips aching. I caught myself bowing to empty rooms, cap jingling to no one. The mask had seeped into the skin. Every hall has a mirror, polished bronze or silver. I avoided mine. On the rare nights I looked, I saw not myself but the fool staring back. Eyes too wide, grin too stretched, bells mocking with every tilt of the head. I wondered then, was the fool ever truly me, or had the motley swallowed me whole? Did I become the mask? Or did the mask reveal what I always was? The mirror gave no answers, only silence, and the faint jingle of my own bells. Madness, masks, mirrors, they were as much my companions as wine or want. I walked the edge of sanity, never sure if I balanced or fell. Perhaps all fools do. Perhaps laughter itself is a kind of madness, shared and contagious. But if I was mad, then the whole hall was too, for they laughed with me, mirrored me, wore masks of their own. The fool is only the most honest of them all, bells proclaiming what others hide in silence. Every age has its dusk, and mine came in motley. When I was young, the fool was the bright spark of any hall. Lords wanted us at their elbows, peasants wanted us in their taverns. Laughter was coin, and we minted it. But years pass, and the world grows restless with old tricks. The bells began to jingle less brightly. The cap grew heavy, and I watched the twilight of my kind settle across the land. It began with the players, troops of actors performing whole plays instead of single fools tumbling about. They came with scripts, characters, stories that stretched beyond a single jest. Instead of a fool juggling onions, you had a tragedy with kings and ghosts, a comedy with lovers and disguises. The nobles leaned forward in ways they hadn't for me in years. They clapped not for pratfalls, but for poetry. And I, sitting at the edge of the hall, felt myself shrinking. I mocked them, of course. I'd leap after their plays and mimic their swooning lovers, their noble speeches. The hall roared, but I knew the truth. I was a parody of what they wanted now, a shadow of the new light. Minstrels, too, rose higher. Where once their songs were background, now lords hung on their ballads, tales of far-off wars and saints. My riddles seemed crude beside their polished verse. I tried to keep up. I added songs to my arsenal, learned ballads, and twisted them into parody. It worked for a while, but parody only thrives while the original shines. When the crowd prefers the original, the parody wilts. The hardest moment came the day the steward told me plainly, "The Lord requires you less now. The players entertain him more. You may go." No dismissal, not yet, but the chill was clear. I lingered in the hall still, summoned only for holy days or when wine loosened the Lord's memory. Once I had been constant at his side, a shadow. Now I was a relic. I walked the corridors at night, listening to the actors rehearsing, the minstrels tuning. My bells sounded thin against their voices. But the taverns never changed. Common folk still roared at pratfalls, still begged for songs about the Reeve's bald head. There I was still loved. Yet even taverns began to crave the traveling plays, the storytellers with whole tales instead of single jests. It was not that they tired of me. It was that the world itself shifted. Laughter had grown hungry for new shapes, and motley alone could not feed it. I met other fools in those years, older, wearier. We drank together, confessed what we would not say aloud. Our time was ending. Once, every hall had a fool. Now, fewer. Soon, none. One by one, they vanished, some to taverns, some to madness, some to graves. The motley that had once been our crown became our shroud. I recall my last true feast. The hall was lit with candles, heavy with venison and wine. The players had just finished a play, tragic, noble, poetic. Then they called for me, almost as an afterthought. I juggled, I tumbled, I sang a bawdy song. They laughed, politely, kindly, but not like before. The laughter was thinner, a courtesy rather than a need. When I bowed, I knew. That was the twilight. The fire had dimmed. Do not weep for me, nor for fools like me. Every age ends, every trade fades. But I do weep a little in truth. We were the mirrors of our age, the laughter in its darkness, the bells in its silence. And though the twilight fell, we burned bright while we could. The twilight of jesters was not death. It was change. Players took our stage, poets our words, actors our masks. But somewhere in their lines, in their comedy and tragedy, our spirit lives on. Motley fades, but folly remains. The bells fall silent eventually. The motley phrase. The jests fade into echoes. And yet, something of the fool remains, even when the cap is hung up and the bones lie still. I've lived long enough to see my trade dim, and I know I will not live to see it rise again. But laughter is stubborn. Folly never dies. It only changes its clothes. After the twilight, I wandered halls less often, taverns more. Yet even when lords no longer needed me at their tables, they still told tales of me. Remember when the fool made the mastiff his jousting steed? Remember the time he set the tapestry on fire and put it out with ale? Memory became my stage. They laughed at echoes now, not at me. I was already turning into a story, a figure half real, half myth. And in that I realized, fools live longest not in halls, but in the mouths of those who remember. I heard my likeness in tales told around hearths. Not my name, no, just the fool, a trickster who outwitted Reeves, who mocked lords, who got away with truths no one else dared. Sometimes he was clever, sometimes stupid, sometimes both in the same tale. And isn't that the point? We were always both, wise and witless, sacred and profane, shadow and mirror. Folklore captured us better than any painted portrait. In stories, the fool never dies. He stumbles, he falls, he jests, but he always rises again. Then came the playwrights. They took our bells and sewed them into new forms. In their plays, the fool became more than motley. He became wisdom disguised. I heard whispers of plays where jesters spoke truths to kings, where their nonsense hid the sharpest sense. I smiled when I heard of them. They had stolen from us. Yes, but it was a theft I welcomed. Better to live on in plays than vanish altogether. If I could not stand on the stage forever, then let others carry the motley in their words. Even language remembers us. Playing the fool, they say, fool's gold. A fool and his money are soon parted. Our motley is stitched into speech itself. The world laughs at fools still, though fewer wear the cap. And every time someone says the fool spoke true, I feel my bells jingle faintly in the distance. We gave laughter where there was none. We gave truth where silence was law. We gave a mirror to kings and a jest to beggars. We carried loneliness in our own hearts, so others might feel less of it in theirs. That was our gift, our curse, our legacy. And though the world changes, though actors and poets take our place, though clowns and comedians wear different paint, the spirit is the same. Every jester, since the first caveman tripped over a stone and made his tribe laugh, is kin to me. I was born in shadows, raised in laughter, crowned in motley, chained in bells. I danced in halls, drank in taverns, wept in silence. I loved, I lost, I jested on the edge of death. And now, in my twilight, I see that I was never just a fool. I was a keeper of laughter, a carrier of truths too sharp to speak plain. When I am gone, the motley will hang empty. But somewhere in some hall or tavern, a man will make another laugh at the powerful, and in that moment, I will live again. That is the legacy of the fool. Not the cap, not the bells, but the laughter that lingers after.